Well, thank you very much, Joe. And I did think of an interesting fact. As I'll explain in a moment, my academic background is in early child development. But you'll never guess what I did my PhD on. Does anybody know? No, I don't think anyone knows. I actually did my PhD on wolves and using a dance notation. So I can tell you more about that later. But so it's an unexpected fact anyway. Thank you all for being here. I mean, I think you deserve credit because most of you, some exceptions, were here for the workshops all day, and it's been a long day and a very exciting day. And I think it's all the more noteworthy because also I don't think there's any contingent relationship between attending this and having access to the finger foods that Joe talked about before. So I'm really pleased you're here. It's also been a great day. I've really enjoyed myself thoroughly. I didn't quite know what to expect, but I decided to come for the workshops, and they've been, because of the people who led them and because of the people involved in them, they've been really interesting, exciting, and educational. So let me begin by asking for your indulgence. And what I'd like to do before I explain what this title's about and start to explore it is I'd like to take just a few moments to say something about the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, which is where I work currently. And I think it's a resource and an organization in Ontario that we should value and be very proud of. I've only been there for 8 or 9 months, so I can't take any credit for anything that they do. But it was established as a result of Bob Ray's commission looking at higher education back in the mid-2000s. And in a sense that there was a need for an arm's length organization of this sort to advise the government on best practices in higher education policy and practice. And not only to advise the government, but to do it in an empirically based way, to look for evidence-based to make those recommendations. There aren't many places like this anymore. And I think in higher education, with any faults that it might have, we need to value and nurture this kind of an organization. We have 3 areas of focus. One is access, looking particularly at the issue that even though in Ontario, and in fact in Canada, we've increased enrollment, increased access massively in the last 2 decades or so, those groups that were underrepresented at that time are still mostly underrepresented. And I think many of us at the time thought it was because there wasn't enough space, there was too much competition, there wasn't enough financial aid. Those things have been largely addressed. And Aboriginal populations, members of the less well-to-do in our society, and first generation attendees are still not there in the numbers that they need to be. And so that's one area we're looking at. Another is system design. In the face of the kind of financial pressures that the post-secondary education system faces and the whole province faces in the public sector, there are issues around not just how do you maintain the financial stability of the systems, but also how you maintain their functional stability, their operational stability, to make sure that they continue to offer students in the province the kind of education that's going to be good for them and good for the province. The third area, which is the one that I'll be touching on tonight, and really just one aspect of it and not in a hell of a lot of depth, is the issue of learning outcomes. And that is, how does one ensure that the colleges and universities in Ontario are continuing to maintain the match between the kind of learning outcomes that students have, what they take away from their post-secondary education, maintain the match of that with the needs of their own needs, but perhaps even more importantly with the needs of our communities and our society. And that, as I say, is the one area I'll be working on. How we do this at HECO, 3 or 4 different ways. One is we conduct and support a lot of evidence-based research. We try to work with and collaborate with some of the leading research and policy organizations elsewhere in the province and elsewhere and outside. Try to bring together people interested in post-secondary education in a variety of ways, an annual conference, but also a lot of smaller meetings, et cetera, to address particular issues. And then finally, to try and mobilize the knowledge that is gathered and is available to have a real impact on the post-secondary education sector. And we do that through publications as well as conferences, etc. And I'll give you a key to the website at the end of the talk. So enough of that. That's my advertisement for the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And let me provide a little more personal context, just so you have a sense of where I come from in this, how I come to be here tonight. Because I'm neither a scientist of learning in any formal academic way, nor am I a cognitive psychologist. I'm a developmental psychologist who has and continues to study early interaction in the first relationship between a mother and a child, where that comes from, what it's like, what its nature is, what the variability is, and where it takes the child later in development. I've been doing that for longer than I care to say, except that there were dinosaurs walking the halls of Western Ontario when I first went there. I found myself in university leadership or administration, much to my own surprise. It was never my ambition nor intent, as it isn't for most who end up being university professors. One day I found myself to be the chair of the Department of Psychology. Shortly after that, I ended up being Dean of Graduate Studies and ultimately was provost at Western. By that time, I have to admit, it was not by mistake, it was by intent. But throughout that time, I continued to supervise graduate students. And I then stopped in 2005. I stepped down, and I think this is sort of relevant, so again, indulge me. I stepped down from the post of provost and returned full-time to my research and my graduate students, and importantly, the graduate classroom that I hadn't been in for 17 years. And so I was able to rejoin one of my favorite activities, which was teaching introductory psychology, having moved from the sort of era of where overheads were kind of high tech to all of a sudden where it was an absolute necessity, or at least it seemed to be more of that if we ever have time, to develop a completely different way of teaching the course. Two of the things I did when I was, let me go one step more. I was then seduced out of that activity after about 5-6 years to the Aga Khan University. And I was based in Nairobi, but we have campuses, the university still has campuses in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Kampala, Karachi, and London, England. It's a strange, weird, wonderful university working in the developing world, and the experience was incredible. But things I did, one of the things I'm most proud of in both of those roles as provost is we also established the first teaching and learning centers at both Western and at AKU during my tenure. So although I don't bring a great deal of scholarly expertise in the areas of this conference, it's something that's concerned me both as a practitioner of higher education and as someone who's put a lot of time and energy in trying to create the sort of environments where our students can reach their own potential and best grow to be civil members of our society and make it the kind of society that they and we want. So the topic I'm going to talk about tonight, beyond course content, how is it learned, or whatever. Beyond course content is one that's interested me for a long time. As I was preparing for this talk, again, a little aside, and this is just to try and keep you awake, is that I was feeling a little wondering whether I really should be giving this talk, since I'm neither a scientist of learning nor a cognitive psychologist. And I was reassured by this quote in a book I was reading from Milan Kundera, the quotes from Kundera. To be a writer does not mean to preach a truth, it means to discover a truth. And I think there's any of you who've written and thought about writing, I think, even though my writing doesn't compare to Kundera's, I think it's an incredibly important insight about the act of writing. And so what I hope today is that, is that in giving this talk, that I'm not here to tell you the truth, and I'm certainly not capable of doing that, but I hope together, and particularly for me, that this will be a way for me to discover a little bit of the truth about this question. Beyond course content, what is learned, and how. And I'll be devoting a lot of the time to talking more about what I mean by beyond course content, but really it's literally that, is beyond the knowledge and understanding of the material in the discipline, be it psychology or chemistry or biochemistry or nursing or education, beyond the technical part. What else, and is it of any importance, is part of what happens in the experience of post-secondary education? And this is a rough outline that'll tell you where I'm hoping to go, is I want to talk about the notion, the model of learning outcomes, the learning outcome model, which I think of as largely to do with the notion of taking things that are largely implicit and making them explicit. Ask whether what you learn beyond course content is really of any importance. Does it matter? What is its importance relative to course content? What are the challenges, perhaps beyond the many challenges that already exist around course content itself? What are the challenges that are particularly associated with these other than course content learnings? And then to ask the question, and I won't answer it completely, it's one I pose more than answer, although I think my answer will become obvious as I go through this, is learning beyond the content, beyond course content, the business of colleges and universities? Is it something we should worry about in a particular way? And particularly how then educationalists and cognitive scientists might work together to address some of these issues. Begin with the question, what do we expect our students to learn? And again, going to the personal reflection, I got the same preparation as most university professors when I joined Western in 1977. My preparation to be a university educator was, I think of it this way, is I was given a course title, a course number, a textbook, a test item bank, which was not digital, it was this big paper thing. I was given a room number, a time, and that was it. And that was my preparation. To the extent that I worried about this question, and I certainly wasn't encouraged to in any deliberate way, I would answer, I'm sure, by saying, well, have I got a good textbook? Have I got the right textbook? Am I going to give good lectures that supplement the material in the textbook? And I'm not sure too much other than that. And if you forced the issue, so I was worried more about inputs than outputs, and something I know all of you understand and appreciate the contrast. I think if I was pushed, I probably would have said, well, I want them to know what classical conditioning is, I want them to know what instrumental conditioning is, and I want them to have some understanding of attachment and the parts of the brain and how they might be related to various functions, et cetera, and so on and so on. But it wouldn't be much more sophisticated than that. I would give them a test, and then I would know whether I achieved the learning outcomes, whether they had met the expectations or not. As I thought about that, I mean, as I taught more, a couple of insights. One was, the longer I taught introductory psychology, and I was teaching other courses as well, of course, but particularly in introductory psychology, I came to the realization that I actually didn't really much care whether they remembered the details of those things. That was of secondary importance. I mean, I expected them to, at least for a while. I expected them to understand those things, et cetera. But what I really hoped is they developed a love of the topic, that they developed a way of engaging the material in a way that was sophisticated, that they could get personal satisfaction from, and it would enlarge their understanding more broadly of the way the world is put together, and that it might prepare them for doing things that would be more advanced. So there was something beyond the content of the course that I came to recognize perhaps was even more important. I wouldn't have gone much further than that. It would have been just those kinds of conversations. The other place I recognized it was in the graduate students that would come into my research group where we studied attachment, and it's quite a technical area if you want, as are most areas that students do their dissertations in. I almost never got a student who knew anything about attachment when they came into my group. And that didn't matter. I was looking for something else. You know, could they communicate well? What were their work habits like? Were they conscientious? Did they show resilience in their work? And if they had that stuff, I knew they'd be okay, and they'd be able to take it on. And I think those insights are really important, and at the heart, I think, of what I'm trying to explore with you today is that there is something beyond course content that I think is perhaps implicit in many cases, but that we've always talked about as being important in what a student takes away from a university or college education. Oops, wrong button, sorry. So, learning outcomes, and this is something that I think some people will think of as a little jargony, the whole area of learning outcomes. We tend to associate it, I think, most of us, with requirements of accrediting bodies and quality assurance bodies that are a little annoying, but we have to do it because it's become the in thing to do. And I probably, although I've been involved in imposing quality assurance and designing quality assurance procedures for a long time and think they're quite important, I was relating to them on much the same level, not so much as an educator, as someone who wanted to deal with it. And I think in many ways, learning outcomes they're a paradigm. And I think the learning outcome paradigm could be transformative or can be transformative. And it's much more than just specifying in a kind of technical way what do you expect your students to learn, although that's an important piece that probably, certainly I, and I think many of us are guilty of not doing and not thinking about as much as we should. But it also means that if we're someone in engineering who is really interested in that students learn the ability to design a particular, or to work in project management, then we need to be sure that if we expect them to be able to do project management, that we think about the way that we would give them learning experiences that would allow them to do that. And we can translate that into almost any of a specific outcome in any kind of course, but we'll ask ourselves, do those learning experiences map onto the kind of specific learning outcomes that we expect? And so to further that the assessments we use are authentic to those outcomes and are related to the experiences we want. So if in psychology I expect students to be able to critically analyze a published paper, I can talk about that a lot and I can do it myself, but I better think about ways that are authentic learning experiences related to that outcome, and then also think of ways of testing them that are authentically integrated with that. So for me, it provides a kind of framework that I certainly didn't have when I started, and I still find very exciting about the way I could think about what I'm trying to achieve with my students. Equally importantly, the process demands that you engage your students in each of these stages and explain it to them. Because for students, I think coming into a classroom can be a little bit like an iceberg experience. And so they can see from the course outline and maybe that first 10 or 15 minutes in the first day of classes, they can see a little bit about what's expected of them, what they're meant to learn. And this is a caricature. I think most of you are very good in the classroom and probably do a lot more than this, so forgive me the caricature. Is that they can see the top there about what they're supposed to learn, but they can't see the details. They can't see the mass of what they're supposed to take away, and it's not made explicit for them. They're aware of the inputs quite clearly, but not quite sure of what the outcomes are supposed to be or how all of that is integrated with what they're doing in the class and how they're being tested. And so a lot of this has to do with learning outcome paradigm has to be going from implicit in the goals, etc., but also implicit linkages between all of the elements of this experience. But if we return to the question of what are the learning outcomes that we expect, for someone like me who spent their life trying to take the very buzzing hubbub of human behavior and social interaction and characterize it in a way that one can deal with it empirically, the first thing I think of doing when you're trying to do learning outcomes is to specify some sort of taxonomy, to try and come up with a way of categorizing what we expect the learning outcomes to be. And one doesn't want to take this too seriously and get engaged in what somebody I once heard talk called the fallacy of immaculate perception. There is nothing sacrosanct about these categories, but they're useful, is that we have the disciplinary specific outcomes that are exciting and interesting, and all of the stuff that we might be talking about today could more or less apply to those as well. But what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk today are these non-disciplinary characteristics, which one might be categorized as basic cognitive outcomes, often linked to numeracy and literacy primarily. The higher order cognitive outcomes, such as communications, critical thinking, and problem solving. And transferable skills, sometimes called non-cognitive skills, although I think that's probably a misnomer, that involve things like teamwork, resilience, and initiative. And that's where I want to turn our attention now, is to those three areas. So let's just talk about them a little bit more. The basic cognitive learning functions, and forgive me for reading this, focus less on content mastery, such as vocabulary or formulae, and more on using literacy and numeracy skills to process information in a real-world situation. And I make that point because, at least for me, although many would argue numeracy and literacy is something that people should be doing, that those responsible for educating the incoming students should deal with, it's not really our problem in the university or college. In fact, we're not just talking about reading or writing, and we're not just talking about being able to do mathematical manipulations. We're talking about something much more complicated, so that if you read a newspaper article about some of the tragic things that have been happening in Europe and elsewhere around security and terrorism, you read a particular article about something happening in France, for example, and want to ask yourself, what does this have to do with immigration? It means more than just being able to read it. You have to be able to extract the appropriate information from reading it and apply it to that question and weigh the various information you have. And similarly with numeracy, if you're interested in whether you want to buy or rent a house, unless you live in Toronto, that's a complicated situation, and it's a difficult decision to make. Certainly for most young people now living in Toronto, that's not a decision at all. But in fact, it's a relatively complicated piece of information. You need to take and understand the numerical information available about monthly rents and taxes and foregone revenue, et cetera, in order to make that kind of decision. You can see how that approaches, and this is where these categories fuzz over into one another. These basic cognitive skills approach the higher order cognitive skills, can be seen in this level 4 description of essentials from Essential Skills Ontario and the Canadian Council on Learning that deals with literacy levels, and this is one of the higher levels, level 4, and you can see that it has terms in it like find solutions to abstract problems and integrate and synthesize multiple pieces of information, etc. So we're talking about literacy and numeracy, basic cognitive skills that are essential to what they're going to learn in class, but also essential, as we'll talk about in a moment, to many other things as well. Higher order cognitive mechanisms. This slide used to say a dog's breakfast. It now says a mishmash, because some of the people I was showing the slides to thought a dog's breakfast sounded a bit rude and negative. And for someone who loves dogs and has always had a dog, I don't find any problem with it. And certainly my dog has no problem with it. But this is almost a mantra for universities, if you look in their mission statements, etc., is that students will come away with better critical thinking skills, problem solving skills, and be able to do higher order reasoning. So these skills are ones that are not only important for us in our classroom, but again, I think are important as students go and take on new challenges in other parts of their lives. They're multidimensional and difficult to deal with. And again, I'll explore that a little bit more as we go on. These transferable skills are the ones that are often referred to as soft skills, and that sounds like they're not very important, so it's probably not a great word to use. But they include a series, and again, another dog's breakfast on another day, of what are largely social kinds of, like interpersonal skills, teamwork, communications tends to be either in this or in the higher order cognitive skills, and a lot of other characteristics that you might think of as character features, personality traits even. They're often treated as that anyway, as creativity, follow-through, work ethic, flexibility, etc. But again, as we'll see, things that not only probably do we think are important in the classroom, but are valued in a whole variety of areas of functioning. Is it important, learning beyond content? This is a slide that is the result of a study of the results, an international study, has the unfortunate acronym of PIAC, and I'm ashamed to say I know what it means. The Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, which the OECD ran with tens of thousands of participants between 16 and 65 years of age in 33 different countries. And what they found is that performance in the essential skills of literacy and numeracy, because that's primarily what it looks at, it also looks at problem solving in a technology-rich environment, that performance on those, their levels of those skills corresponded to higher levels of these areas as well. So employment, the better employment and greater earnings, levels of trust in others, self-reported, the amount of volunteering and community engagement, sense of political efficacy, and self-reported health conditions. These are, although obviously the top one has to do with the sort of financial and business-oriented or productivity-oriented elements, some of these things have to do with what the OECD calls social capital. So trust in others, community engagement, political efficacy are things that we expect of people who are going to be productive and civil members of our society. So at least from this perspective, there seems to be an importance to them in that they correlate with things that we probably think are valuable for graduates of our programs. If we go to the students themselves and ask them what they think is important about what they take away from their education, 65% of them say, undergraduates say they hope that their degrees are going to prepare them for the workforce, let them get good jobs. Many others then plan additional education beyond that, and if you added that, we'd probably approach almost all of the students saying that in the end, that their time at the university or college is something that's going to contribute to them getting a decent job and a stable job in the future. So it's not unreasonable then to ask, what do employers say is important in our graduates? And this is a recent survey from 2016, Aon Hewitt, but this is replicated over and over and over again in almost any employer survey. And you can see what we have here is mid-level candidates and entry-level candidates, and the effect is more or less emphasized for the higher level, the mid-level candidates. But you can see the things that people report as being the most important skills and capacities are things that we've been talking about, non-content kinds of characteristics, such as leadership skills, people skills, collaborative and teamwork skills, etc. A report in the Globe and Mail as recently as Monday, and again, these surveys happen all the time, is that 843 or something Canadian employers were asked, are Canadian universities preparing graduates for the needs of the employers? These are Canadian executives, the business leaders, and 41% said yes. The rest said, well, not too good to lousy. And so then when the person who did the survey was asked, well, why? What he said was business leaders often complain that graduates don't have the soft skills they need, such as good communication, writing, or strategic thinking skills, and that the shifting focus on technical training is preparing more workers to fill skilled jobs, but it's leaving other gaps that are frustrating employers. So employers are also saying that these skills are important to the people coming to them out of universities and colleges. Just a kind of preview of something I'll emphasize shortly is that the question is, I mean, is this just their opinion, or is this true? Even if it's a widespread opinion, is it really true that this is what the problem is and that they don't have these skills? I don't think we really know. If you listen to what university leaders say, and again, I could have chosen many people here, and this is Max Blau from Wilfrid Laurier University, in the Globe and Mail a few years back, saying, when a university graduate is recruited, the employer has in their employ an exceptional communicator, an adept researcher, a problem solver, and a critical thinker. Again, it is almost a mantra among university administrators and leaders when interviewed, that this is the value added of a university education. This is why people should be attending university. This is why the business world and donors should be supporting. Again, implicitly saying these things are really important, and we do a good job at enhancing these skills in folks who attend our programs. Recently, obviously, as all of you know, there's been a downturn in enrollment and the attractiveness of programs in the arts and humanities. And one of the arguments that many people have made in an incredibly articulate and compelling way is that even though one might think that many of the kind of technical knowledge and understanding that someone brings from a history program or an English program or a language critical theory program is not particularly relevant to most workplaces, that these students come out with a higher order ability, a very sophisticated, superior ability in things like communications, critical thinking, problem solving, working together in teams, et cetera, et cetera. And that this is the value of those programs and why they need to have a continuing place in our universities. And although there's a certain self-serving, pragmatic element to that answer, I think it's actually heartfelt. An anecdote, again, of my own is that when I was provost and visiting the University of St. Andrews, as you all know, I'm sure, a very prestigious university in the UK, I was talking to my counterpart there, and he made this point. He said that it's really interesting when people come from the city in London, the financial districts and the financial companies and corporations in London, and for recruiting, they don't go to the business school first. Where they go is to the classical studies program. And that they take the very best graduates from classical studies, and what they say is, look, I don't care whether they know anything about finance or the business world. I want students who can write, who can think, who are good critical thinkers and problem solvers, and I can teach them that other stuff. And so, again, indeed, there's a sense that these are important characteristics. And it's not only about jobs. And when Joe was asking me some questions before the talk, and one of them is, well, should we be the servants of, and you didn't quite put it as negatively as that, but should we be the servants of the business world, et cetera? Is that our job to train people to work, in the banks, et cetera, et cetera? And although I don't think we should be embarrassed about that, I mean, we do need people who are out there and are able to be productive members of our society, et cetera. It's not just about jobs. And so whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about international security, whether we're talking about building a wall between Mexico and the United States, whether we're talking about the recent research on flossing, these things are critically important, perhaps not flossing, but I like flossing, but these are things that require, in an increasingly complex world, require a lot of these skills. And they require not only that you be able to do them by yourself, but they're things you need to be able to engage others in, to communicate with others. These are important to our society, and this point was made in a cartoon in the Globe and Mail about a week ago, and it's a bit of a crass cartoon, but forgive me. And what this says is this is the Democratic National Convention, and these are people all with hats that say "Make America Great Again," and this, mind you, coherent argument isn't for everyone. And leaving the politics aside, we don't want a citizenry that don't get coherent argument. It's just not good, because they can be exploited, they can be undermined, they can be seduced in ways that are incredibly dangerous for them, but even more so for the society at large. So I would argue that these things are indeed important. What are the challenges we face in sort of dealing with and fostering these if we think that they're important, period? Because it may be they're important, but they're not things that we should worry about here. even though we claim, in fact, that we enhance, that going to a college or university enhances your ability in these areas. Well, you have to think now about the things I mentioned earlier about the learning outcomes model. You have to be able to specify them. We've talked a bit about that. We have to ask ourselves, what are the learning experiences that would enhance them, and how do we assess them? And those things with these issues are probably much more complicated and more debatable than they are for disciplinary content issues. So it's easier said than done. I love this cartoon because it captures a lot for me. What it says is I taught Stripe how to whistle. I don't hear him whistling. I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And so we say that our students, we teach our students, or in the course of our programs, they are taught critical thinking, problem solving, etc. But to be honest, what evidence do we have of that exactly, other than anecdote and relatively unsupported conjecture? Not a hell of a lot. So we're not very different from this kind of circumstance in those areas, and it's not something we should be comfortable with. I mean, if anything, we should be empirically driven and evidence-based in our claims, and I would argue that we're not. And certainly that was true of the universities I've worked at, and I was guilty of the same thing. At Aga Khan University, one of the main things we argued was, in contrast to the relatively poor post-secondary education experiences that were available in most of the areas we worked in, we did all of these things. We turned out these much better students who had many of these characteristics. But there were a couple times when, after saying that, I sort of said, well, wait a minute, if I'm pressed, what am I going to say? What evidence am I going to show? More importantly, how are you going to manage it? I mean, how are you going to ask whether you're actually achieving those goals and you're optimizing your students' abilities in those areas if you choose to do it? So it's not just accountability, it's also, if you don't measure something, you can't get better at it. The other question that complicates issues in this area is the teaching paradigm, and here Paul Tough, I think, was referring to the sort of the traditional teaching paradigm. Is that the right one to use when it comes to fostering these skills? A very important set of issues to pursue. So as scientists of learning or cognition, here are some of the issues I think in this area that are particularly important to explore that we don't know a heck of a lot about now yet. What's the relative influence and interaction of inheritance and experience? With a lot of those character traits in psychology, we do know there's a high level of heritability. That doesn't mean that they can't also be affected by experience, but we need to look more at that and understand that better, and that would be an important thing to know. So that if we're talking about something like conscientiousness or resilience, these are important issues. And similarly for the other non-content areas. What is the contribution of broad, longer-term experiences versus the short-term kinds of experience that we can offer during the course of a post-secondary education? In my work, finally a way to bring my own research into this talk, what we've been able to demonstrate, myself and many others, is that early experience in the first year or two of life between the mother and the child contributes to the extent to which the child develops a sense of self-worth, and that sense of self-worth has a big impact on the way that children react to failure, and whether they see failure as a situation in which they're really validating themselves and therefore are traumatized and don't want to face any kind of challenging situation again. They're not resilient, versus students who see challenges and a degree of failure as something that's a matter of course and doesn't really challenge them individually. So that's something that at least is contributed to very early on. An important question is, irrespective of the kind of early experiences that students have, are there ways that we can build that sort of resilience irrespective of the kind of earlier experience they have or not? I mean, I don't think, we don't have answers to those questions. To what extent are the non-content skills we're talking about truly a result of our programs, or are they more generally the result of being at university and being at college? I mean, is it a non-specific function of the kind of experiences that you have? How can we optimize these things if we choose to do so, the environment? And how do we create I don't know whether I'm trying to see what I was thinking about is the difference between these things. How can we optimize the learning of non-cognitive capacity? How do we create the optimal learning environment? They're more or less the same. Just, I was thinking about it differently, obviously. So how, in more specific ways, what might we do as scientists to try and address and move down this road? We need better conceptual and operational definitions of these skills and competencies. We need better assessment techniques, and it's something we're working on a little bit at HECO, and many of you are in your own areas. Certainly there are people in Canada working on it and doing some very good work. We need to look at the developmental origins of these things, the ontogenetic origins of them, and what seem to be the precursors. We have to ask about transferability. Are these things transferable in different contexts? There's a bit of a debate in the literature about whether some of these higher order cognitive skills are unique to a particular context and then don't transfer to another. And then the implementation science piece. How do we create the environments best where this is going to happen? And I think there's one more, and we've got to exercise outcome-based practice. We have to change what we do if we want to achieve certain things, and we show that we're not doing it. Just a final few slides. In the area of critical thinking, for example, just to illustrate some of the challenges that exist, critical thinking is a very messy topic. It's something that people have been talking about since education began, going back to Plato, I think, or Socrates, and yet we're not really sure exactly what it is. It's a very vague topic. People have thought that perhaps it's better to break it down into what seem to be some of the mechanisms that underline it: problem solving, communications. Issues of metacognition, what role does that play in critical thinking? Some people who are worried about these issues in the classroom are doing things. There's an exercise that I particularly like, never tried it myself, which is to double test students. So to give them a test by themselves and then have them do the test, go over the test and do the test with a fellow student, and they have to discuss, argue about, and explain why they chose one answer versus another, or why they answered the question one way versus another way, to try and make explicit their thinking processes around the question, hopefully encouraging metacognition and in turn encouraging critical thinking. What are the best ways to assess it? Most of the methods we have now for assessing critical thinking are very expensive, very time-consuming, and the reliability of the tests are not particularly good. These non-cognitive skills, such as resilience, for example, are very multidimensional. They clearly, things like resilience or something like interpersonal skills have tremendous dimensions to them. People spend their lives studying things like interpersonal skills. So in order to break these down and to find ways to foster them in, again, an evidence-based kind of way, we're going to have to deal with the whole range of questions that I talked about before. Even when people are taking these things on, there are dangers involved. And this is just a reference to some work done by Angela Duckworth, whose the term grit is associated with, and the notion of resilience. She and her colleagues have put a great deal of effort into developing measures of grit or resilience in order to explore them in a scientific way. What she wrote this article about in the New York Times was in reaction to several counties in California, I believe, who had taken her tests and were applying them as kind of key performance indicators in county schools, in the county schools, and that would be linked to funding, etc. And this was not the way that these tests were never designed for that. It was way premature to try and apply it in that way. There are a whole series of issues to do with where grit or resilience comes from and whether it has anything to do with what happens in the schools, etc. So there are dangers in going down this road because, as with much of what you do, people can pick this stuff up and use it in the wrong way. So to conclude, is learning beyond content the business of colleges and universities? And I think it's something I would encourage everybody to ask themselves, because I think, you know, one can imagine more than one answer to this question of well-intentioned, smart-thinking people. I don't think the answer is completely clear, but I think what is true is that we claim it's something that our students acquire and enhance in the time they're in colleges and universities. It's something that I think indisputably is important in a broader sense, and therefore I think we need to deal with this question, and there are consequences to how you answer that question. So learning beyond content certainly matters, and in some ways I don't think we have the choice of not wrestling with it if what happens in our classrooms is important to us. And certainly I think the study of cognition in a whole range of ways can really be an important way to inform our practice and to deal with this question as we go forward. One of the things we're doing at HECO, at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, that I'm involved in, is a pilot project that's sort of related to this area. It's related to the area of literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in a tech-rich environment. And we have recruited 19 colleges and universities in Ontario in a relatively large pilot study where we're going to be looking at over 10,000 students, half of them incoming and half of them graduating, and basically asking whether a new online version of the test I've referred to before, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and this has got a better name, which is, although I'm not sure what it means, Education and Skills Online, whoever picks these titles. But so we're using the Education and Skills Online instrument to assess literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in a tech-rich environment, to see whether it has a sensitivity to pick up these kinds of changes in students in post-secondary education, and whether it's practical. It's online, it's much more convenient, but it's still a bit demanding of the student. So McMaster happens to be one of the universities that in fact is involved in this, and for that we are very grateful, and all of us are very excited about the project. So let me return to the quote from Milan Kundera, and as I was preparing for this talk, it seemed to me that we can twist what he was saying and hopefully still retain his intention and his wisdom if we say that to be a teacher does not mean to preach a truth, it means to discover a truth. And although this is not evidence-based, I think the philosophy and the intent behind it, for me at least, suggests that if that's the kind of approach that we have in the back of our mind when we're thinking about our teaching skills, that a lot of these non-content skills that it will develop, and in understanding that and looking at it carefully, we can begin to understand what those skills are, how to best assess and measure them, and how to encourage them. My last pitch, returning to HECO, this is our webpage. If you'd like, it's a great website, lots of amazingly valuable information, I think. If you get on our mailing list, you will not be able to avoid it. So it's just HECO-CEA, so it's a very easy web URL. So, thanks.